Janet Crack has asked me to be part of this service and to talk about what I love about theater and or musical theater, especially. I took some notes as we talked and thought about how it has enriched my life. What about it makes me happy? Well, my love for theater has to do with many things. I find that it often tackles universal themes of life, putting thoughts into words and actions that people often may not be able to do. Plato stated that art imitates the objects and events of ordinary life. In the event of watching a play or a musical theater, the viewer is not only entertained, but can become immersed in the story being told and relate to the emotions evoked by it. Theater tells a story that has been designed to engage the subjective audience in a range of emotions that can encompass empathy, compassion, love, disdain, or sorrow. Theater, especially musical theater, has given me some psychological coping mechanisms to move through various times in my life. The lyrics and music to a great show tune have been put together by talented, thoughtful people who bring to life the universal human experiences of joy, love, sadness, and our tribulations. I am quite a bit right-brained, and much to some of my friends' dismay, I frequently break into song, sometimes in response to a question or, hey, just for no reason at all. My brain lights up and my body gets active when I turn to a show tune that succinctly expresses how I may be feeling or that may correlate with a similar life scenario. For example, as at various times in the past, I might have been feeling down, defeated, or hopeless. I turned to musical theater and have found myself singing. Please indulge me. When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high and don't be afraid of the dark, and on and on. Thank you to the sound of music. And somehow I am outside of myself with the realization that this theme is for everyone, as we have all been through a time that has made each one of us feel like that. In the times of feeling fearful or lacking confidence, again, I have turned to another show tune that has given me another sense of universal communal experience. Whenever I'm afraid, I hold my head erect and whistle a happy tune, and no one will suspect I'm afraid. Fake it till you make it, some might say. Thank you to the King and I. The understanding of this universality has contributed to positive growth in my own confidence and character building. As some of you know, I have been a wedding officiant since 2009 and have thus far performed over 700 wedding ceremonies. I work with each couple to create their personalized ceremony, and I'm always intrigued by each couple's background and their own story. Choose your own adventure, as one bride called it. This vocation has been of immense joy for me as I get to use my honed skills of communication, psychology, yes, and theater. It is not only the order of words put to paper, but how they are projected and transmitted to your audience that they give meaning. Here is a frequent passage choice by many of my couples. In the days ahead of you, there will be times of conflict and times of joy. Harmony will be your reward if you follow this advice. Let your love be stronger than your anger. Learn the wisdom of compromise, for it is better to bend than to break. Look for the best in your beloved rather than the worst, and confide in your partner and ask for help when you need it. Remember, it is true friendship that is the basis for any lasting relationship. Give your spouse the same courtesies and kindnesses you bestow on your friends. Every morning when you wake up and every night when you go to bed, say, I love you every day. The frequent words spoken and the output of my psychological energy that goes in performing ceremonies reaches a receptive audience and reflects right back to me like charging a phone battery. I cannot promise what the rest of their lives will be like, but I can give them a meaningful day for a head start as a new couple. Especially in the last number of years, our lives have been filled with an onslaught of fears, confusion, frustration, and anxiety. In addition to mindful breathing to calm myself in times of overwhelming breaking news with yet another assault on democracy or other dejected provocations, I stop and I start singing. And if I can't sing it, I play it. One of my favorite show tunes. The song, Do You Hear the People Sing, from Les Miserables, is a battle hymn against all unfairness and oppression, urging people to join in and come together and resist the systems of oppression. Though I have seen this production many times, each time I leave the theater, I am emotionally moved with tears in my eyes.
Good morning. I'm Christine. When Kelly and Janet asked me to do a reflection on theater, I was thinking about what to do, and then Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Buddhist teacher, passed away. And I thought, well, that's much more important than anything that I could possibly say about theater. Then I heard him laugh in my ear, and I do not know a lot about Buddhism. Most of what I know I've learned from Liz Young, but I heard him laugh thinking, oh, Christine, you've missed the point. So what I do know is that Thich Nhat Hanh was about 3 principles, which were mindfulness and compassion and nonviolence. And when I started to think about those things, I thought, oh my goodness, there's so much connection to theater. So I want to share a little bit about that. And the first thing I want to do is introduce you to Beatrice from Much Ado About Nothing. So this is Beatrice's uncle asks her if she would like to get married. And this is her response. Not till God makes men of some other metal than earth. Would it not grieve a woman to be overmarried with a piece of valiant dust? To make an account of her life to a clod of wayward marl? No, uncle, I'll none. Adam's sons are my brethren, and I hold it a sin to match in my own kindred. I read a little of Beatrice, and I apologize for not being able to memorize it. I did understudy her and was privileged to play 1 performance, but that was years ago, and I haven't had time to go back and memorize. But I don't know what you heard and what you didn't hear. But my point there was all about compassion, that underneath Beatrice's quick wit and her sharp tongue, but she is known for being very good-humored. Underneath that is pain, right? The pain of being rejected in love, the pain of loss, through death of people that she loves. And in order to play her, the actor has to really understand that. You really do have to walk in her shoes if you're going to give that experience to the audience, right? To help the audience connect. So look what I found yesterday. Yesterday, I found this article. This is from the Royal Society of Medicine. And the article is entitled, Shakespeare's Empathy, Enhancing Connection in the Patient-Doctor Relationship in times of crisis. Holy cow! All right, so as some of you know, I moved on from theater and became an occupational therapist, and now I am an assistant professor and teaching. But on my bookshelf in my office, I think it's the biggest book there is the complete works of Shakespeare. And when people come in my office, I get some comments, and now I can show them this article and say, yes, I can use Shakespeare to help my students connect with their patients. Of course, I knew that all along, right? But there's something validated about seeing it in a medical journal. I want to read to you a little bit of what Dr. Jeffrey says. Human relationships are constrained by the inaccessibility of other minds. Any conclusions about another's mind must rely on human interpretation. Shakespeare's defining gift is his empathetic approach. Each of his characters speaks in their own voice. Shakespeare depicts the world from the other person's point of view, not just their understanding, but their emotions and their moral perspectives, encouraging the audience to empathize with both heroes and villains. Shakespeare's approach creates a space for interpretation and reflection to experience empathy. Creating such a space for reflection is a central part of clinical practice and medical education. Wow, I really love that. But let's get back to Beatrice and emotion. So Beatrice and Benedict, they come to realize that they are in love with each other. And at about the same time, Beatrice's cousin and her best friend, Hero, is supposed to marry Claudio, who's Benedict's good friend. And at the wedding, in front of the whole town, Claudio accuses Hero of knowing the heat of a luxurious bed. He shames her in front of everyone, casts her inside, and basically leaves her for dead. So Benedict, who now we know is expressing his love for Beatrice, she asks Beatrice if Claudio is her enemy. And this is what Beatrice says. Is it not approved in the height a villain that hath slandered, scorned, dishonored my kinswoman? Oh, that I were a man! What? Bear her in hand until they come to take hands, and then, with public accusation, uncovered slander, unmitigated rancor. Oh God, that I were a man! I would eat his heart in the marketplace. And when Benedict asks Beatrice what he can do to help and to show his love, Beatrice has two words. Kill Claudio. So suddenly, for me, that space for reflection opens up, right? How do we process that violent response if our own moral compass is one of nonviolence, right? So for me, theater, movies, and even television, they give us space to talk about that if we take the opportunity. You know, I don't have this in my own little script, but I also have to say, for me, what theater has always been able to do is to express strong emotion, which can be very difficult in everyday life, to share with someone how you are really, really, truly feeling. So, thank you for giving me the opportunity to express that a little bit. Okay, let's go on to mindfulness. Being absolutely in the present moment is something that when you are in theater, you have to do. Everyone works differently, but for me, having to relate to the audience, be totally aware of what's going on in the environment, and have a real relationship with the actor on stage, you can't do that without being absolutely mindful. And you have to breathe to get there, right? So the breath is super important. Right, so when I joined this congregation, I actually was reminded of something that I had learned in theater, and that was beautiful. But there's another part of this about mindfulness, which is about living in the present. Have you ever heard of the play Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean, Jimmy Dean? So this was actually a play. It's written by Ed Grazik, who was a playwright. There was also a movie. And I learned that Ed Grazik actually came to Erie and worked with Erie Playhouse. So I'd like to share a little bit of one of those characters from Come Back to the Five and Dime. Her name is Mona. I'm going to try to do this from memory, and I could not find a script, so please, Mr. Grazik, if you're out there somewhere, excuse me, I'm going to butcher these lines, and it's going to be paraphrased, and my accent is going to be terrible. And yeah, it's going to be hard to hold the mic and do this at the same time. Okay. So this is Mona, and what happens is she's with a group of young women who are teenagers during the 1950s when James Dean is filming Giant. The highlight of Mona's life is that she gets chosen as an extra in the movie. And 20 years later, she comes back, thank you, Kelly, she comes back with the friends who are in the James Dean fan club to have a reunion. So this is Mona 20 years later describing what happened when she went to be the extra in that movie. I was sitting in the back of the Buick, and James Dean walked right up to the window, and he had a cigarette dangling from his mouth, and he was fumbling in his pocket for something, and so I just took a guess, and I said, I got a match, if that's what you're needing. And these are the matches that he touched. Now, I'd let you hold these, but you might rub off the fingerprints. Here. When I looked up into those crystal clear sky blue eyes, it was just like looking into a mirror. And I knew something wonderful was going to happen. And the next day, when they picked me out of all those other thousands of people, I knew it was true. And you can see me in it too. Elizabeth Taylor's head keeps getting in the way, but I'm there, mainly behind her left ear in that big picnic scene. So that's Mona. And she goes on to say that she actually spent the night with Jimmy Dean. Excuse me, I dropped my glasses. And in the morning, we watched the sun peek over the edge of the roof, turning the sky into the brightest sight you ever saw. And she tells her friends that they slept together and she had a child. And that child was James Dean's son, and it was all a lie, right? But Mona can't get out of the past. She lives in the past, and the damage that she does to herself and to the people around her is really devastating. Do you know anybody who lives in the past? Or do you know anybody who holds on to something from their past, whether good or bad, and can't get beyond it? And the pain that that causes, right? So, Mona reminds us to live in the present. She also reminds us to have empathy for those of us that we love, who either hold on to a grudge or have trouble moving on. And she's not a particularly likable character. So, you have to have compassion for her in order to really play her, right? You have to love the character in some way, find something about them. So we have Mona reminding us to live in the present, and Beatrice reminds us that we can be good-natured while still acknowledging the pain that we experience, right? So I want to share one last line of Beatrice's, because this is one of my favorites in all of Shakespeare. So Beatrice in the script, she doesn't have a mother, And it's not really said, but when I was working on the character, in my mind, her mother had died during childbirth. And that helped me understand some of Beatrice's pain. So this is the line where the prince says to her, after sort of asking her to marry him, but she's in love with someone else, so he says to her, "Out of question, you were born in a merry hour." And Beatrice responds, "No. Sure, my lord, my mother cried. But then there was a star danced, and under that was I born." Isn't that beautiful? I mean, you've got in one line the pain of loss and the joy of living. So that's what Beatrice is to me. And it reminds me of a concept in acting called playing the opposites, which a director that I worked with, a wonderful man, explained playing the opposites. This was his way of explaining it. When you're working with someone on stage, no matter if you don't like that person, or if you're playing a character that hates that person, or is angry with that person, or especially if you don't like that person, or you're supposed to be angry with them, find the love. Always find the love. One thing to love about that person or that other character that you're interacting with. Because he said, it's the love that makes you human. So here's my thought. If I can just take that, maybe, that's what helps me to honor Thich Nhat Hanh, right? It's being able to, in another person, see the light, to see the love. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Regis Sabol, and I'm here to tell you the story of Prospero, my mother, and me. Back in the spring of 1972, I was a graduate assistant in the first year of my master's program in English at Gannon College. Yes, it was that far ago. It was a college. My newspaper career had blown up in my face about a year earlier, and I was reinventing myself again. I saw a casting call for a Gannon Little Theater production of Shakespeare's The Tempest. I'd never done theater before, but I had a yen to give it a try. What the hell? After reading the play, I decided to audition for one of the smaller roles of one of the two villains, Sebastian or Antonio. Needless to say, I was more than a little surprised when I was cast in the lead role of Prospero. Maybe it was because I was 4 or 5 years older than the other more experienced actors who auditioned. Maybe I just got lucky. I invited my mother to come up from Pittsburgh for the opening of the show in May. You have to understand something about my mother and me. We had a complicated relationship. I'm told I was the apple of her eye, but I was also her greatest disappointment. I was the fourth of 4 boys adopted by Agnes and Whitey Sabol, Richard, Robert, Ronald, and Regis, all packed into a 4-room house with a second-story view of downtown Pittsburgh and a bathroom in the basement. That made my mother a saint in the eyes of her fellow parishioners. You see, my mother was a proud, devout Catholic. In other words, she was a religious fanatic. And she was grooming me for the priesthood. Now, most mothers want grandchildren. My mother wanted a priest. And in my child's mind, at least, I was well on my way to the cemetery. Cemetery, it could have been a cemetery. I was well on my way to a life of celibacy. You could see why I would call it a cemetery. Until the summer I turned 14. That's when I met Judy Hamilton, my first girlfriend. One passionate kiss. We never got much farther than that in the summer of '58. And I no longer sought a life that did not include sex. Lots of sex in my mind. So much for the priesthood. My mother couldn't understand what happened to me. Her pious little boy had morphed into some sort of cigarette-smoking juvenile delinquent. Almost a year out of high school, in January 1964, I disappointed my mother again by taking a job as a small newspaper about 50 miles south of Pittsburgh in Waynesburg. I was leaving home. But my mother was cool about it. She even bought me a car, a 1951 Plymouth High Drive from my Uncle Johnny, the used car dealer, for $100. It broke down halfway to Waynesburg. There's a lesson to be learned here. Never buy a car from a used car salesman who plays the ponies and is still living above his in-laws with his wife and his 2 near adult children. What can I say? A little over a year later, I sent my mother a postcard. It read, "Hey Ma, guess what? I just got married." I realize now, in retrospect, actually rather recently I realized in retrospect, what a callous and cruel thing that was to do. But my options were, oh, by the way, my mother had met Ginny once before. A couple months earlier, I took her to the wedding reception for my cousin Jackie. That's my Uncle Johnny's boy. And Ginny and I arrived fashionably late. And as soon as my mother saw us, she walked right up to me, and her greeting was, "Why did you bring her here?" So I couldn't very well call her and ask her for her permission to get married, could I? Then a couple months later, I up and marry a Protestant in a Baptist church. And I wasn't even of legal age. The ladies at the Greene County Proprietary's office never thought to ask that nice young newspaper reporter who came around every day for his birth certificate when he applied for the marriage license. "How could you do this to me?" my mother demanded when she called me, as if my marrying Ginny was all about her and what I did to her. she was heartbroken. Then, almost 3 years later, our son Tim was born. You know, it's amazing how the arrival of grandchildren can mend relationships. It's like some kind of magic. And an uneasy peace fell upon the land. Now, my mother, as she approached her 72nd birthday, was dying. Type 2 diabetes, complications of type 2 diabetes. She was half blind, she had sores on her legs, and she was weak. But she wanted to make that 2-hour drive up to Erie to see her little boy in a play. And so my brother Bob, my mother's factotum, drove her up to see the show. It was opening night. In the 4th row sat my mother, Ginny, my brother Bob, and Tim. In Act 4, Prospero addresses the audience. To me, at least, this soliloquy is the essence of Shakespeare's greatest valedictory, a view of death that draws more upon Greek philosophy than Christian doctrine. And so I looked directly at my mother, even though she could barely see me, and I spoke to her. Our revels now are ended. These, our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits and have melted into air, into thin air. And, like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve, and like this unsubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little lives are rounded with a sleep. Now, after the show, came down in full costume, went over to my mother and gave her a big hug. "Who is this?" she demanded. No, I'm the only guy in a theater full of strangers wearing a purple cape with a crown on his head. As I said, she was half blind. It reminded me, her reaction, in fact, reminded me of it. One of the times I called her on Mother's Day. "Happy Mother's Day!" I told her. "Who is this?" she asked. Almost 5 months after that, my mother lay on her deathbed, dying in a Pittsburgh area hospital. Ginny and I drove down to say our goodbyes. The poor woman was terrified. "I don't want to die," she cried. "Regis, please pray for me," she pleaded. No, I could have gotten all self-righteous and said, "No, Ma, we talked about this. You know I don't pray." But I didn't. "I will," I promised her. After all that time, what difference did one more lie make? After all, she was the only mother I'd ever known. Hers was the only face I remember from that adoption hearing from when I was 4 years old. And she loved me. It's just too bad that I could not return that love. Be able to love her in return. You see, like my Prospero and my promise to pray, my love for my mother was more performance than practice. Almost 2 years, she died a few days later. At the marathon 3-day viewing, members of our parish consoled her boys with the knowledge that my mother was surely in heaven because she was such a saint for taking us 4 boys in. I performed several more shows at the Gannon Little Theater the next few years before returning to the stage in 1995 at the encouragement of my younger son, Jason. A year later, I fulfilled an actor's dream by portraying the role of George in a Roadhouse theater production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I also had roles in other productions at the Roadhouse and other local theatrical venues. One director said that I was the finest character actor in Erie. But I wanted to be a star! Just kidding. I never had any illusions about my talents as an actor. I always understood that I was merely a talented amateur. Perhaps that's why as I got older, the lines got harder to learn, and I eventually stopped doing theater. It's been 20 years since my last show, and as Shakespeare might have aptly put it, now is the winter of my discontent, and there is no glorious son of York coming to make things better. Like T.S. Eliot's J.I. for Prufrock, I seem to be spitting out the butt ends of my days and ways until the final curtain. But I still look back fondly on my brief time doing theater. It was such a thrill. And I'll never forget saying to my mother, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep."